Hello, this is Mr. Pereira, and I'm going to be talking with you through one of the final sections of relationships, and it's called virtual relationships in social media. As we can see from the specification, they've been quite specific here. They're asking us to look at self-disclosure in virtual relationships and this thing called the absence of gating. Just a reminder that this is self-disclosure in virtual relationships and got nothing to do with factors affecting attraction. Now, if you are on social media, if you have a smartphone or any of these devices, the apps that you see on the screen will be pretty much familiar to you. And the video, if you follow the link and watch it, will show you a young person talking about Snapchat and how the streaks were kind of influenced her friendship groups and how potentially losing friends via streaks, by breaking a streak, is important. And there's going to be a couple of things that we need to kind of recognize is that this is a course on virtual relationships, and assuming it says here that these popular websites are not really what they're talking about, but what they're talking about are interactions with people that are completely virtual. Now, using one of my evaluation points, I kind of question some of these types of things. But just in terms of kind of terminology, obviously face-to-face would be kind of normal, everyday kind of interaction with people, and then obviously virtual is interactions on a virtual way. Now, I have chosen to look at self-disclosure in terms of a number of things. And the first thing I want to kind of raise is there's a very kind of old kind of principle back from 1971 where it said that if you are on the public domain, so I'm assuming that things virtually are in the public domain, and it says you present an edited version of self. And I think all of us are familiar with this idea that virtually we can kind of either change our appearance or we can potentially kind of edit kind of what people see and how people see it. And so we can argue that in self-disclosure, to a wider audience, there's going to be this idea that I can be more selective over the content. Now, what we appreciate is that the reason for this could be so that we can compensate for a lack of control. So the very first thing we need to kind of recognize in terms of self-disclosure is that in virtual relationships, we're presenting an edited version of ourselves. The next thing I kind of choose to do is to look at the hyper-personal model. Now, the textbook and other notes might kind of focus on the absence of cues, and I will mention that in a moment. But I feel that the main point kind of that I want to make is that online people are more personal and they disclose more. Okay, greater disclosure. And this links to this idea of the strangers on the train. Also, once again, quite an old study where people were confronted by competitors to sit next to them and start talking to them. And they were quite surprised to find that people really actually opened up to these strangers and spoke to them about personal information. So what we find is that we then can say that self-disclosure is greater in virtual relationships, and that virtual relationships encourage self-disclosure. Okay. Earlier on, it says, and we also could say that this is partly down to this idea that I can alter what I put on those communications. And so the hyperpersonal model has two key factors. The first one is that selective self-presentation, and we have the ability to portray ourselves in the best possible light. Okay, so we've all seen this where maybe you use a filter, or you take a particular camera angle, or you only post things that are amazing. Oh, look at me, I've done this amazing thing, I'm on this great holiday. And of course, that's where we have things like hashtag creating memories. And of course, in terms of virtual relationships, this idea of promoting myself in a selective way and kind of leads back and potentially encourage intimacy because I can be hyper honest or hyper dishonest. this idea that I can pretty much say what I want to say in order to get what I want to achieve, um, and that can be either honest or dishonest. The second thing, obviously, that the virtual model kind of relies on is this idea of feedback, and this idea of reinforcement. People, as I said, you might put kind of these amazing pictures of kind of what you're doing, and people go, "Oh, wow, that's amazing," and you respond to that. Now, the last thing about the hyperpersonal model that I'd like to add is this idea of anonymity as well. And we see here that this direct link to that strangers on the train. It says that when you are aware that you will not see them again, or they don't know your identity, you are likely to kind of um, kind of kind of share things with them. There's also another concept of de-individuation. So this can affect the person sharing and the person kind of viewing the shares. And this comes from Zimbabwe's prison study, where people who potentially have their identity hidden may act in an antisocial way, which could involve in disclosing more in that particular context. And if you watch this particular video, you kind of see, they're pretty much explaining his hyperpersonal model. So, in terms of virtual relationships, I actually think it's quite straightforward. This idea that self-disclosure potentially happens quicker, it potentially also happens at a greater level, and we can explain it through the hyperpersonal model. And of course, we need to remember this whole editing self. However, many of the early kind of research into disclosure and things like that would probably argue this, that actually disclosure is not as good, because it says it depends on face-to-face interactions. There are cues that we could notice. For example, we can notice the person isn't paying attention or very interested in us, or just in terms of their body language. And so, of course, if I'm only communicating with them virtually, people have argued that it's less effective. Now, how you can use this reduced cues is obviously as another component of self-disclosure for virtual relationships, or can actually quite literally be used as some kind of counter-argument to this idea that actually it's hyper-personal because it's not as personal, because it's less effective. And it's a very clear idea that non-verbal cues, pretty much, or emotional cues, will be absent, and so therefore we can't tell a person's tone, and therefore we will not disclose as much because of two things. So either people will be quite blunt or aggressive, so therefore we might not want to enter into a relationship with them, and also these kind of communication can be impersonal and less meaningful. So the reduced cues argument is quite literally that we tend to not disclose more in the virtual relationship. So that was the first main concept that we need to have a look at. The second main concept I wanted us to have a look at is the effects of absence of gating. Okay. Now, of course, the first thing we have to kind of recognize is kind of what does this mean. So in a face-to-face interaction with somebody, we may have things that act as barriers. Okay, so the barrier or gate. Okay, and so this could be a physical feature, or you could be shy, or you might be insecure. Any of these types of things that could act as a barrier. So I may not be able to meet somebody and have that factor affecting attraction, which would be self-disclosure, because they're going to reject me initially. Okay, and so it is possible that you could have this type of scenario. So you have a, if we look at maybe the matching hypothesis, or we look at some other kind of understanding of attraction or theory of romantic relationship, two people could potentially be perfect for each other and compatible, but this gate, this physical feature, like maybe their looks or something else, or shyness, prevents them. So gates prevent. And so we do argue then that on online there is an absence of gating. In other words, with virtual relationships, they flourish or they happen because I can do things like present and edit itself. Or what McKenna and Barr say here is that there's little distraction. So maybe my shyness or maybe my physical features or any of those such things do not distract the person from actually disclosing or kind of talking to me or getting to know me. And so the other aspect of this is also in terms of anonymity. We have this idea that I portray myself completely differently virtually, so that kind of superhero self. And we see that there's something called like Second Life, where people kind of portray themselves online in a completely kind of different way. They live their true selves online. And so these are two examples of how the absence of gating may promote virtual relationships. So I think something like if your gate is your confidence, you can then you can consider what you're going to actually write before you respond. Or if you feel that you're unattractive, you can do that edited picture, that edited self, and that could kind of help you have that particular virtual relationship. So there we have the content that we need to know. So if you go into your textbook, these are the lifeline ideas that come up, and what we need to be able to do is to be able to talk in a meaningful way about self-disclosure and the absence of gating. This is just that Second Life example that I used. You can click on the links, it kind of gets a bit weird because people obviously virtually, because of this idea of potentially being anonymous or not actually interacting with people in a real way, can live a completely different life, and this particular organisation saw an opportunity to make money out of that particular situation. Okay, so I think the content is fairly straightforward. There's been a number of essays and questions that have come up that will expect you to write an essay on it. So we do need to look at some of the evaluation points. So the first thing is, if you have used the reduced cues argument in your knowledge, then you can use this evaluation point. Now clearly, the reduced cues can be an evaluation point itself, and then this would be the counter to that. Okay. So what we need to kind of argue quite literally is that it is wrong that we have reduced cues. And Walter, for example, said there are other cues that we can use. So however long somebody takes to respond, that's why the messaging apps have that ... it kind of keeps us engaged and stuff like that. We also know acronyms and emojis and other those type of things make it very kind of easy for us to manipulate that particular conversation. And there is research that potentially supports that using emojis and these type of acronyms can actually be beneficial in your communication. The last thing we can also say is that the particular services like Snapchat and WhatsApp and any of the other messaging services are so popular and kind of worth a lot of money because people use them. So therefore, reduced cues seems to be a bit of a ridiculous argument to make. So it is possible that online communication is just as meaningful as face-to-face. Okay, so it's quite a nice argument to make, certainly worth doing. So then, looking at other aspects of this idea of disclosure, and I thought I'd kind of show you that there is actually some biological evidence to support this idea that disclosing is something which is rewarding and good. So we find, for example, people kind of disclosing on Facebook, when their brains were scanned, the part of the brain that is associated with pleasure, the exact same diagram they used in the addiction module, the nuclear accumbens, is lit up. Okay, so these areas are activated when they start to talk about themselves, and less so when they talk about somebody else. And of course, it was even greater when they were sharing it with friends and family members. So it seems that actually this idea, we might find it inane, somebody kind of posting a picture of what they had for lunch, or kind of what they're doing, or kind of sharing things kind of about their lives. They're actually receiving some kind of pleasure process from this. And so we could argue that actually self-disclosure is an important aspect of virtual relationships because it is rewarding in itself. Okay, so there we go. Now there's not a direct counter to that, but if you're looking at the absence of gating, we also see that there's quite a lot of kind of evidence to support that is actually quite useful. Okay, so people actually use the online community to kind of support kind of their shyness or kind of any other barriers that they might have. And I've also read articles on how Facebook, and looking back at previous posts and stuff like that, can be self-soothing for people as well. So it seems that that online, that these social media websites basically can empower naturally gated individuals. Okay, and of course, there's no direct kind of counter to this, other than of course we need to be careful of this idea of that if it kind of opens up the gate, it also opens up the gate for people to stretch the truth and to promote themselves in perhaps a true or false way in terms of the hyper-honest, hyper-dishonest model. So clearly there's enough evidence out there to support that disclosure and absolute gating are kind of important aspects of virtual relationships. There's also this is the link to the hyper-honest, hyper-dishonest model. Whitty and I think it's meant to be Johnson, not Johnson, basically said that people do use the virtual relationships as a means of being hyper-honest or hyper-dishonest. And they said that people are more direct and probing and intimate when they're online compared to face-to-face, because face-to-face we have to actually often use small talk, where we talk to people about the weather, or we talk about things that are less important because it's socially acceptable to talk about that, and less socially acceptable to ask probing questions or intimate questions in a social context. So ultimately, it is possible that virtually we do have an exaggerated kind of situation where either we post ourselves in a positive light and we can potentially kind of share that intimacy in a direct probing manner, and this of course aids relationships kind of forming. Okay, so quite a lot of evidence kind of out there. Now, what I do want to kind of start pointing out is that a lot of this ideas about virtual relationships was research done kind of pre-2000, and we see here in 2017, perhaps at a stage where people like yourself have grown up with mobile phones throughout your kind of adolescence, and you're familiar with both face-to-face and virtual type of kind of interactions. And so this particular meta-analysis actually says that so there's no significant difference between virtual relationships and face-to-face interactions in terms of self-disclosure. So that's actually quite important. So to try and explore this idea more about kind of where research is potentially happening, I'm saying that a lot of the research that we'll look at, and we do look at when we kind of create a course on virtual relationships, is before the year 2000. An example of this was published in 2000, will say things like people are more able to express their true selves, okay, which may well be true, but however, they're looking at something specific called computer-mediated communication, or CMC. And CMC, in my opinion, and it could be argued, is actually kind of not really common. It's not something which we use, it's perhaps an academic term, and also come pre-social media websites. Facebook was significant, and that's about 2006-07, when that's coming about. Dating apps like Tinder or Bumble, any of those type of kind of dating apps are kind of commonplace now, but they weren't commonplace pre-2000. And so it is possible that we have a completely warped view of virtual relationships, and that 2017 research that says that there's no real difference, or this wealth of research that says that actually relationships aren't just face-to-face or virtual, they're multimodal. And as such, our understanding of virtual relationships are quite broad because of that. Okay, this is an exam question that came up in 2022. You can see it was a 16 marker, and they do ask you to talk about both self-disclosure and absence of gating. It's actually come up more than once since 2017. So therefore, it's quite a common kind of topic. Seems that maybe in terms of exam preparation, I would look at can you kind of write about one or the other in terms of the context of what to do. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was good. Take care. Bye.